Welcome back to Science, Freedom, and Education. We are going to be continuing our series on the biology textbook adopted by Clay County, Florida. But the information we're going to be covering in the next several videos is going to be the meat of evidence for evolution. And so we're not going to be going a page or 2 pages per video like I have been in the past. We're going to be going very, very slow through the textbook, although we're going to be providing a wealth of information. I don't want to skip over this because it's so important, because if you can show these pillars as they have been called to be false, then the whole rest of this collapses. So we're gonna spend quite a bit of time on each of these topics. We may spend more than one video per topic because it's so powerful. And what we're going to cover today is we're going to start off by talking about how the textbook does not teach students to think for themselves. It tells them what to think. It gives them information. It gives them the conclusions rather than giving them the evidence and teaching them how to draw their own conclusions, which is the bedrock of science. A real science, true science, does not say this is what you think. The science is about this is how you explore evidence and come to your own conclusions. So we're going to cover that, and then we're going to talk about fossils. In the past, I've done videos where I've said we'll get to that. We're going to talk about that. We're going to eventually cover that. Well, here we are. This is where these next few videos is where we're going to be covering those things that I said hold on for. So I'm going to start off with the textbook, talking about what's the top matter of the section. We're in section 10.4. But after that, we're going to get into the idea of fossils themselves. So at the top of the page, it's 298, which I will provide a copy of that in the text below if you're watching on Facebook. Says evidence of evolution. The key concept: evidence of common ancestry among species comes from many sources. A reminder, evolution is not just change over time. They say that a lot. Well, evolution is just change over time. Surely you know that animals change over time. And that's a misdirection. Whether it's purposeful or the person is just programmed, it doesn't matter. That is not what evolution is. Here is what they're talking about when they mean evolution. It has to do with that common ancestry, that all life started off as a single-celled organism. We all come from that same single cell. All the life you see, all of the animals, all of the plants, everything, bacteria, you name it, it all comes from that single common ancestor. And so that's really the heart and soul of evolution. Also at the top, the main idea is evidence for evolution in Darwin's time came from several sources. We're going to cover each of those so-called sources are the pillars of evolution. And then it says structural patterns are clues to the history of a species. And again, that word species is not very well defined, but we're going to talk about those structural patterns in a later video. Also, the vocabulary, biogeography, homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures, those are all for a later video as well, but they're in this short series that we're going to be doing on the pillars. It's just not what we're going to talk about today. The last thing is, unfortunately, this is the state standard, SC.912.L.15.1. Explain how the scientific theory of evolution is supported by the fossil record, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, biogeography, molecular biology, and observed evolutionary change. So we're going to cover all of those. We're going to start with the fossil record today, but notice how the state standard words it. Explain how the scientific theory of evolution is supported by the fossil record. Well, that's a leading question. What if I don't believe that that's the way that it happens? What if I don't believe that the evidence supports that? All of those things, they don't support it at all. In fact, they support an entirely different idea, but we're not here to talk about that specifically, but we're here to show that these things, these alleged pieces of evidence, don't actually explain what the state standard says it explains. Excuse me. So let's get into the text of the main meat of the text here. We're at the very top. It says, connect to your world. Whenever you need to complete an assignment on an unfamiliar topic, you first need to gather information. The different pieces of information might come from the library, the internet, your teacher, or maybe even your friends. Together, all these pieces help you understand the topic. Darwin also drew information from many sources, all of which helped to strengthen his understanding of evolution. No, that's not what happened. Darwin came up with his idea of evolution, and that was the conclusion, and then he looked at a whole bunch of pieces of data, and when he was looking at that data, he said, how can I make these fit my conclusion? And that is the ultimate source of bias. That is not how science should be done. Science should be about, all right, this is the evidence that we have seen. What does this evidence tell us? And then we follow the evidence to whatever conclusion is demanded by that evidence. We don't start with a conclusion and then try to fit the evidence into that. So, main idea. Again, we're on page 298. It says evidence for evolution in Darwin's time came from several sources. Darwin found evidence from a wide range of sources to support his argument for evolution. So, see, that's what he's doing, is he has an argument, he has a conclusion, and he is looking for ways to support that. And there aren't any. And we're going to take each one of these apart as we come to it. The most important and convincing support came from fossil geography, developmental similarities, and anatomy. So today we're going to talk about fossils. And I'm just going to read the text to you, and then I'm going to address a lot of this hoopla over fossils. It says, even before Darwin, scholars studying fossils knew that organisms change over time. Scientists who study fossils focus on more than just the fossil itself. They also think about its age, its location, and what environment was like when the organism it came from was alive. In the late 1700s, geologists wondered why certain types of fossils were found in some layers of rock and not others. Later studies suggested that the fossil organisms in the bottom or older layers were more primitive than in the upper or newer layers. Geologists during this time were mostly interested in the order in which fossils were found within rock strata, as a record of natural events such as earthquakes, not as proof of evolution. However, the sequential nature of fossil groups and other findings in the record supported Darwin's concept of descent with modification. So that's it. That's all they present on fossils specifically. They give us a little bit of connection to geology moving forward, but we're going to talk about that another time, but this biogeography is a completely different section, so we're going to come to that in maybe another video here, maybe not the next video, but probably one or two after this one. So let's talk about fossils. First of all, this is not enough information to even form a real conclusion on. When they say that this is the proof that evolution is true, you can't give you can't give just a paragraph. The fossil should be its own unit because there's so much to cover. And the information that they provide in this particular section is so scant that it amounts to nothing more than you should believe us because we're scientists. That ad verecundium type argumentation that doesn't really teach kids anything. There's nothing here other than this is what geologists found. This is what geologists found. This is what evolutionists found. This is what scientists found. That's not teaching anything. That's not talking about the evidence. That's saying that, okay, scientists found something that they believed ended in the conclusion of evolution. And that's awful science. So let's talk about what they're actually talking about. First of all, scholars studying fossils knew that organisms change over time. See, there's the misdirection, and there's the scholars teaching. Scholars knew this, so you should just listen to them. And they knew that they change over time. Okay, well, what does that even mean? Animals changing over time. You could talk about a dog growing up. You start with a little puppy, and then it grows into an old dog. You can talk about a population of different animals that adapt to their environment. Well, that animal hasn't changed from that kind of animal. It's still the same kind of animal, but yeah, as the environment changes, they can adapt. What they really mean is that the scholars, these scientists, these evolutionists, these atheists believe that animals started off from a single organism and evolved changed into the wide variety and complexity of life that you see today. That is not something that scholars agreed on during Darwin's time. It was a relatively new idea in the 1800s. So it's a misdirection at best in the textbook, if not a flat out lie. It says scientists who study fossils focus on more than just the fossil itself. They also think about its age. Well, back in Darwin's time, how would they know the age? They didn't have radiometric dating to prop it up. And so they had to guess, they had to assign, they had to impute ages to these. And the main thing that they did was they did relative ages. And they made the assumption, and folks, please understand, it is an assumption. It is not anything other than that. An assumption that the higher the layer, the younger the fossil, or the younger the animal was when it died. And it is based on the idea of uniformitarianism, that the Earth has continued as it always has, that since life began, that the environment of the Earth has not changed, and it completely ignores the idea of catastrophes or cataclysms, as I like to call them, where some major event on the Earth radically changes the environment. And that might be like a global flood, for instance. And if we hold to that paradigm, if we start from that paradigm, then we end up arguing based on that paradigm. Well, if that paradigm itself is false, then every conclusion drawn from that paradigm is false. So to say that the fossils are a certain age because the layer formed, the animal died, and it's trapped in that layer, and then millions of years the fossil forms, and then another layer forms on top of that that's slightly different. First of all, that destroys uniformitarianism anyway. To say that there are layers says that the environment did change, and you end up, it's a self-defeating argument just on that aspect alone. But the other thing is that fossils, their argument is that fossils form over long periods of time, and that gives the layers time to lay down and trap the animal and whatever. The problem with that is that organic matter doesn't fossilize over long periods of time. If you have a fossil, or if you have an animal that dies and it doesn't fossilize rapidly, then it gets completely obliterated by the environment. You've got bacteria, you've got all of these environmental factors that cause the decay and the breakdown of these organic molecules. So fossils have to form rapidly, or they don't form at all. That's why we find so few of them. The other thing that relates to that is Darwin predicted in his evolutionary hypothesis that we would find millions upon millions of fossils to show the little micro transformations from a prior species to a current species. And he said that's definitive evidence. If you don't find that, evolution can't be true. Well, we don't find that. We don't find that at all. In fact, one of the big things that is a huge problem for evolution is the lack of fossils. We have to look at the lowest layers, if you will, of the geology, of the geological column, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the lowest layers contain all these very simple organisms that are not complex at all, according to evolutionists. And then all of a sudden you get to the Cambrian era, and suddenly we have all this complexity and all this variety, and they can't explain how it got there because they're missing all of those alleged transition fossils. And then once we get to the Cambrian era, the steps from any so-called ancestor to a common animal, the steps are not many and slight variations. It's major step, major step, major step. Like, for instance, we could talk about the whales, how there was this sea creature that became a land creature that became a sea creature again. Well, the steps are really about 5. When Darwin says there should be thousands upon thousands of microtransactions to get from the whale ancestor to the land-based whale ancestor back into the ocean whale ancestor. And that is a huge problem. In fact, it was such a problem because the uh, gold standard, if you will, I don't want to call it Holy Grail because it's too much of a mix there, but the gold standard for evolution is human evolution. If we can show transition fossils going all the way back to an ape-like ancestor, then that proves it. That proves it in a way that is so psychologically powerful that nobody can deny it. Well, that's been such the gold standard, and it's been such a missing thing. They've even coined the missing link over and over and over again that they have to make stuff up. And I'm not going to get into those specific examples in this video, but many of the so-called missing links from ape-like ancestor to human are made up. They're flat out fabrications or lies. They get in the news, and it's this big hoopla over, we found another missing link, we found another missing link, and then, oh wait, that's a pig's tooth. And then the newspaper will print a retraction on the 16th page, and so the only thing that's in the public's mind is that there was a missing link found, and we study those, and we study those, and we study those, and then, oh, by the way, there was a retraction that wasn't really a human ancestor at all. Well, that's flat out lying. People talk about, well, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Well, no, it's actually documented that it's a lie. And me pointing out that it's actually documented as a lie doesn't make me a conspiracy theorist. It just means that there's a lot of people out there that are very big on fanfare for promoting evolution, but when evolution has problems, suddenly there's a very small voice, and that is dishonest. You can call it whatever you want to, but it's a lie. It's dishonest to me. So that's a huge part of it. Another part of the fossil proof, or the alleged fossil evidence, is that they keep talking about this geological column, this layers that we find here and there, and there's only one place in the entire world where the whole geological column is found, from the very lowest layer to the very highest layer, and that's in biology textbooks, because it doesn't actually exist as a physical thing. They have to take a piece from over here in the Grand Canyon, and a piece over here in Australia, and a piece over here in Asia, and they piece these things together like some kind of a big jigsaw puzzle, and they use these index fossils, and they say, okay, so if this fossil was found in this layer, that must mean that it's this age. Well, how do you know it's that age? Well, because we found that fossil in it. Well, how do you know that that fossil was in that age? Well, because it's in this layer. Yeah, you see the big circle? And if you take away the assumption of the ages in layers and that connection, then you don't have anything. You just have some layers of dirt and some animals trapped in it, and they fossilized, usually very rapidly, and that's it. That's all that says. To say that there are these millions of years, something is missing. And we'll talk about radiometric dating and carbon dating and all of that another time. But when we talk about the fossil layer itself, it's just one big fat assumption, and it is hugely problematic for the evolutionists. And I'm gonna bring in some quotes in my next video from evolutionary scientists that show that. But just the idea that the geological column is what is proof. It doesn't actually exist anywhere. We could talk about a couple of other things in this video before I sign off. We'll cover some more material in the next one on fossils. But one of the big problems that the evolutionists have is when we talk about fossils, there are a number of places where the fossil evidence actually shows some coexistence of man with dinosaurs. And I'm not going to get into some other evidences that show that. I just want to talk about some of the fossil evidences. There is a place out in Texas called Glen Rose, Texas, where you can get into the riverbed there, and they have found dinosaur uh, uh, footprints. And inside those footprints, they have found the footprints of men fossilized within the the footprint. And so what it looks like is either the men that were there at that time were either herding or hunting these dinosaurs. And the idea that the footprint of the dinosaur and the man were found in the same layer just utterly destroys this idea that layers are millions of years of time, and man and dinosaur are separated by 65 million years and whatever. So when you find that kind of stuff, um, then you've got problems. When you find a hammer, an obvious hammer, fossilized in the same layer, you've got problems. When you have um, a moccasin with a trilobite, which is supposed to be one of those lower layer uh, animals from the earliest time before the Cambrian period, when you find that fossilized within a moccasin fossil print, you have to reconsider your evidence, the way that you're interpreting your evidence. Um, when you talk about these geological layers, where some places the geological column, as it's called, is turned on its head, that the layers are backwards, or when you find trees fossilized through multiple layers. There have been a number of instances where a very large tree has been found in multiple layers, and they say, oh, well, that's an earthquake. Well, there's no actual evidence of an earthquake taking place, because if you have an earthquake, then those geological layers would be sheared off. And so, what the tree represents is a tree that is being moved about by turbulent waters. And as the waters are settling down, that tree gets jammed into one of the lower layers and is stuck there. And then layers of sediment, as the waters calm down, the layers of sediment, of different kinds of sediment, settle around the tree and lock away the oxygen. And so that organic matter is trapped away from oxygen and other things that would cause it to deteriorate over time, like all organic matter does. And what it does is it causes the tree to fossilize within an oxygen-free environment or an oxygen-rare environment, and it fossilizes throughout all those layers. And that is a huge problem, again, for this particular proof of evolution. So the idea that the fossils in the fossil layer is, or the geological column is somehow evidence of evolution, you have a huge number of problems that the evolutionists cannot deal with. And you can hear something along the lines of excuses, or something along the lines of rationalities, where they try to say, well, this could have happened, or this might have happened, or you even go back to the text itself. It says, uh, later studies suggested that the fossil organisms in bottom or older layers were more primitive than the upper or newer layers. I'm sorry, but that's not science. Suggested and maybe and whatever, those are words of, I have a hypothesis, but I don't have any actual evidence that demands that conclusion. Science is about knowing truth. And if all you have is suggestions and maybes, that's not enough. That's not enough to come to the conclusions, and you can't build an entire house out of suggestions and maybes and biases and all of these things, these assumptions that they make to arrive at their conclusion, because your house is going to be a house of cards. And we've talked about cosmological evolution and the age of the universe and blue stars and all of that. Now we're getting down into the things on Earth itself, and how their evidence alleges evolution, and these are supposed proofs and stuff, but we're going to find that each one of these is based on these suggestions and these maybes. And when you have that many put together, you have a hypothesis that isn't proved at all. You just have a bunch of stuff that you strung together because you wanted it to go together. And science is not about desire. Science is as devoid of desire as you could possibly get. Science is about, I know this to be true. Scientia, to know. And if you don't know, you can't say that you know, and you certainly cannot teach it to students who are young and impressionable and pretend that it's the truth. And when you do that, you are a liar. And that's why I'm doing this series, is I've had enough of it. I'm tired of it being taught in the schools. I'm tired of it being presented as if it's true when all we have are some suggestions. And sorry, you're going to be called out on it every time. And I refuse to teach such nonsense in my own classroom. Thankfully, I teach physics. I don't have to put up with a lot of this nonsense. I teach motion and forces and electricity and color and stuff like that. I don't really have to get into all this nonsense, which is why I chose to teach physics, is I can avoid all of these lies. But when I hear my students coming up from biology and much less so chemistry, but when they come out of that biology class and all they're spewing is this nonsense, I'm going to say, well, what does the evidence actually teach you? Well, the scientists say, well, I don't care what the scientists say. Scientists are human. They can be wrong. What does the evidence say? Well, that's right, because you weren't taught to actually examine evidence. You were told what to believe. You weren't taught to examine evidence. And that's not science class. That's indoctrination class. That's brainwashing class. So anyway, I'm going to cover some more on fossils. I'm going to have some specific examples and some specific quotes by evolutionary scientists the next video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have found this to be helpful in some way. If you have any questions, feel free to leave comments below. I'm going to be posting this up on YouTube, so I would love to have more subscribers. Feel free to share, and until next time.